Television and film can be lumped together by a person to make it easier to discuss. So you can say the films of George Lucas instead of saying Empire Strikes Back, A New Hope, Return of the Jedi, and so forth. Or you could just be like John Woo films, or maybe even the Oceans movies. Then there's the television, which is right up my alley, because I'm talking about the Schurverse. Michael Schur is a television producer, writer, and actor who has been broken off from the legendary producer Greg Daniels' talent tree. Greg Daniels of The Office fame. Schur has developed shows such as The Office, Parks and Recreation, Brooklyn Nine-Nine, The Good Place, Rutherford Falls, Master of None, to name a few. This is quite a list of television shows that can make your sides split with laughter. But just looking at The Office, Schur was a producer and eventual executive producer for The Office for many years until he left for his own show. But in his time there, Schur helped produce some of the most cringiest, awkward, uncomfortable, funny episodes of television that he wrote, produced, and starred in. Schur wrote classic episodes such as The Office Olympics, Traveling Salesman, and Dunder Mifflin Infinity. Trust me, look them up. And to make things even better, Schur not only wrote and produced, like so many of the characters on the show, they were also writers as well as talent. Schur played Dwight's cousin, Mose. The comedic gift that Schur has brought to the tiny screen is something that not many of us have. But thankfully, he didn't waste it. If he did, my DVD collection would be a lot smaller. We would be robbed of the shows like The Good Place and their unique perspective of what it means to be a human and the weirdness that we are and that is life. Or Brooklyn Nine-Nine and all the memes from Jake Peralta to Captain Holt to Cheddar the dog. Cheddar. But for me, the big daddy of them all comes from Parks and Rec. Parks and Recreation is a comedy series that focuses on the character Leslie Knope, who is the deputy director of the Parks and Recreation Department for the fictional town of Pawnee, Indiana. This simple approach to comedy is done through a mockumentary style of the day-to-day of a city official. Well, yeah, that sounds like a terrible idea for a show. I'd rather watch Chicago Streets and Sanitations. But it's not. It has ballooned tiny little characters into an ensemble cast that drives the funny about so many boring little things. From what it takes to build a park, to having a farting heart attack, to tweeting at work, to dating your coworkers, to running for office, city budgets, and so forth. In the show, the city of Pawnee, Indiana is not special. In fact, it's filled with very obese people who are unusual to describe them. These hard-working folks are neighbors to the fictional town of Eagleton in the television show. And the two cities could not be more opposite. Eagleton, Indiana, from the show's history, says that it's a neighbor city of Pawnee and has a population of 9,500 people. Shortly after Pawnee was founded in May 1817, a group of the wealthiest and more prominent citizens, finding the soil untenable and smelling unpleasant, evacuated to the west and founded Eagleton. Eagleton, which is located on top of a hot spring, which allows them to grow plants that cannot be found in Indiana as well. According to Leslie Knope in the show, Eagleton is the land of rich, snobby jerks who have stolen all their money before seceding 2 centuries ago, leaving the town of Eagleton and Pawnee having a very negative reputation among each other. But the funny twist for this rich and snobby city is that their appearance of wealth and privilege is all just an act. their town hall meetings while they give away free iPads and blankets and champagne and even have a create your own omelet bar. In all reality, they have no money. They're in big debt and they are broke. While the people of the town of Eagleton are not real, and I know they're not real, and they have been exaggerated for comedy's sake, but we can be a lot like the people of Eagleton, Indiana, in our life. We can be wasters of resources, wasters of talent, of gifts, maybe even wasting our lives. It could be as simple as something as small and simple of buying something we're never going to use, and eventually just giving it away or throwing it away. Could even be wasting a skill or a talent that we've been given, like playing an instrument, singing, chair stacking. We must not be so flippant with the resources that God puts in our lives and is what we need to learn from the first chapter of the book of Esther. We need to learn from this book of Esther about not wasting our resources. So we're going to open our Bibles to the book of Esther and learn from the basic, simple principle of use your resources wisely. Last week in our first episode of Esther, Perfect Timing, we looked at King Ahasuerus and Esther, a little bit about them. I think it's important that we remind ourselves about the king and his empire before we jump back into the story about him. The Persian Empire is a name given to the dynasty centered in modern-day Iran that spanned from, follow this, the 6th century BC through the early part of the 20th century AD. The first Persian Empire was founded by Cyrus the Great around 550 BC and became one of the largest empires in history. It stretched from part of Europe, eastern part of Europe, like Greece and Slovakia, through Egypt in the south to India in the east. King Xerxes the Great, or Ahasuerus, as he's also called, was the fourth king of this empire, ruling from 486 to 465 BC. He was the son and successor of Darius the Great, and his mother was Atossa, the daughter of the first king, Cyrus. King Xerxes is the leader of this vast empire for the time period of the story, and he had everything he needed, and then some, from lots of people to serve him, to money, power, great neat things, which is why the latest king in this kingdom shows right away in the chapter 1 of our book is that his attitude is one of party and revelry. Look with me at chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. Now in the days of Ahasuerus, who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. In those days, when King Ahasuerus sat on the royal throne in Susa, the citadel, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a feast for all his officials and servants. The army of Persia and Media and the nobles and governors of these provinces were before him, while he showed in the riches of his glory, the splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days, 180 days. The first thing we need to discuss are his houses, his responsibility, this waste of resources. In 1:2, we see that Ahasuerus was ruling from his throne in the city of Susa. This wasn't where he normally led from, because this was not his main house. In fact, this was his winter destination, his other house. The city of Susa had been the capital of the ancient empire of Elam, and Darius I rebuilt this city and used it as his residence before Persepolis became his capital, and Xerxes did the same thing. He used his main residence at the city of Persepolis and then Susa in the wintertime. And the house that King Ahasuerus lived in is not, notice that I didn't say house in the original verse, because it says that in verse 2, it is a citadel. The citadel here means acropolis or fortified area above the rest of the city. The citadel fortress was a rectangular platform 72 feet above the general plane of the city, surrounded by a huge wall 2.5 miles long. This place was secure. This place was impressive, grand, and not really necessary. Because this house that his papa built is not even his main place to live. It was just a getaway when he was too cold. Now, I understand this is a clear example of wasting a resource, and it probably is. But I'm not here to criticize him for having a secondary house. A lot of us do. Not me, but a lot of us do. Sometimes it's needed. The frivolous things are needed, like going for a weekend getaway, or buying something small to help out the house. But what is more odd than going to another house for another time period is the party itself. That is inexcusable. While we can't always justify having to buy little things, but here King Xerxes could have done better. And the party is a clear example of that. Because in verse 1-3, we read that he threw a feast or banquet for all his officials and servants. Not just the ones in Susa. Not just the ones in his central province, but all 127 provinces worth of officials, governors, nobles, servants, and the army. Is it wrong to have a dinner party? No, I've had many. But this shindig was nothing normal by definition of a feast, especially the length of it. The Hebrew used here to describe a feast, was the mitha. It's used to describe both a banquet and a drinking party. So why would the king hold a kegger with these royals, and why did it need to be 180 days? Some think that the nature of this party was because it was a celebration of his rule. Some think that it was a morale-boosting party in prelude of his campaign against the Greeks in the 4th year of his reign. See, I can see it as a little bit of both, because since it had the nobles and governors there, this was a perfect place for you to expect the king to swill sherry with his pinky finger stuck in the air. But then again, since he had the army there, I could also see it as kind of like a little bit of a place where he and the army could do keg stands or beer pong or whatever people do like that at parties. Maybe it was used for both. Well, verse 4 gives us a little bit of information when it says that it was showing the riches of his glory. So I would think that this hootenanny that had anyone who was anyone invited to it, where they drink. Yeah, they may have taken time to plan the next military campaign. I mean, they're all in a room, but that was well in between the time of drinking and revelry. But in spite of the reasons to have this type of box social, the real question we should be asking in regards to this empire-wide call for a drinking contest was, it lasted 6 months? It's not what its purpose was, but why have it? If this was just a planning meeting for the upcoming campaign, why drink? Why show off the riches of power that is within the king? Couldn't he just have like the top generals over in a much, much, much smaller group and plan this? It's kind of like having everybody invited to a staff meeting that really just could have been just done over email. I think we understand what that means. The other aspect of this party is that it's a kind of a drain of resources, a waste of resources, because it had the nobles, the army, the governors, the officials, servants were bound to the citadel of the king for 6 months. Yes, and I know the army, it was winter time and the army does an army in the winter. but they were still stationed throughout the empire, a very big empire. And they are a great deterrent for trouble or mischief. But instead, they're at getting drunk with the king at a fiesta. The same principle applies to the nobility, the palace leaders, the servants, the governors. There's a huge cost to this party. It's a huge waste of resources. Ahasuerus had to bring in all these people to Susa, feed them, hold enough wine and food, find places for them to live for 6 months, for sleep, find replacements so that the empire wouldn't fall apart, so they could do their job. Just looking at the food, drink, and cost alone for a group this size is a large waste of resources for 6 months. Think of what the king could have done with the money. Instead, he blew on, I don't know, chips and salsa and cases of beer. I don't know. Think of the money that could have been used. Could have helped, fed people with, gotten people out of debt, slavery, pulled them up from their station in life. Instead, the king wasted and squandered away his resources in a drinking binge for 6 months. Are we this level of wasteful? No, I'm not asking you if you're going to just quit your job and do nothing and just get drunk for 6 months like King Xerxes did. No. I'm asking you if you're using your resources wisely. The resources being our jobs, the things we have, our money, our talent, our skills, the influence that we have, the things that God has gifted towards us. Are you using them to help other people? Are you using them to grow the church, to serve God? Or are you squandering them away, ignoring them, hoping that they would be destroyed? Every person and everything in our lives is there for a reason. You may be embarrassed by how well you sing. Maybe you can coordinate well. We shouldn't be, though. Use these gifts to help the church, help save souls, because there is not a talent, not a skill that God has given us that is a bonus, that is useless, that is just extra. And that goes for our money too. Save it. Spend it wisely. Definitely not on a 6-month party for a few thousand of your closest friends. And definitely not on throwing a second party days after the first one ended. Look with me again in chapter 1, verse 5. And when these days were complete, the king gave for all the people present in Susa, the citadel, both great and small, a feast lasting for 7 days in the court of the garden of his king palace. There were white cotton curtains and violet hangings fastened with cord of fine linen and purple to silver rods and marble pillars, and also couches of gold and silver on mosaic pavements of porphyritic, marble, mother of pearl, precious stones. Drinks were served in golden vessels of different kind, and the royal wine was lavished according to the bounty of the king. The drinking was according to this edict. There is no compulsion. For the king had given orders to all the staff of his palace to do as each man desired. So, it is like the man doesn't learn. I mean, I'm trying not to be hard on Xerxes here, but he just got off a 6-month party. For the important folk. And maybe he didn't want to be alone. Maybe he was dealing with the world's worst hangover. Whatever. Either way, another week of party is in order. And this time it's just for the winter home staff. The Susa Citadel folk. Maybe you could think of this as like a thank you party after surviving the past 6 months. But this is no ordinary rager, because in verses 6, 7, and 8, there's a different motive behind it. Because verse 6 starts emphasizing the dazzling luxury of being of the king in his Persian palace. And verses 6 and 7 really paint a picture of aesthetics by describing in very much detail, an unusual amount of detail, the ornate beauty of the garden and his home. trying to paint a picture for the listener of what's going on. While normally in the Old Testament, the writers were very economical with the words, very concise. There is no conciseness here. Instead, he's showing off the beauty of his garden, beauty of his home. And the writer of Esther clearly gave a sense that showing off the beauty and the false pretenses for this thing, it had alternative motives than just like a little thank you get together. And I know there are plenty of Xerxes stands out there listening, and I understand the man just had elaborate taste. I do not. He did. But the man's extra. I say that because legend tells us that his tent in the previous Greek campaign, the one that they retreated from and lost, and he eventually had a 6-month party, this one, his tent was loaded. Xerxes' retreat during the Greek campaign, where he left one of his tents abandoned in the camp. The Greeks surrounded it, finding out that it had gold and silver couches in it. Can you imagine a more uncomfortable couch? Gold and silver. Though the world still lives for material things such as wine in gold goblets, Christians have a different value. Xerxes loved money and status and things of that nature. Christians cannot. That's the point. Because this party, these parties, the goblets that he used, the curtains, the violet, the gold, the expense, the lavishness, that's the problem. This is not a wise way to use the resources that God has given us. And as believers in God, we cannot live by the definitions that the world sets, or like King Xerxes is doing, where we grab the most stuff as possible, be as frivolous and wasteful as possible, as long as we're taken care of. That's not how it is. That's how we ruin our testimonies to the community of influence that we have. And that's also how we destroy the natural resources that God has given us. If we're consumed with appearance, like King Xerxes is here, how we are perceived by others in our lives, through social media, for instance, we will usually give in to the demands then of materialism, of what silly, unimportant people say that we should do, like Xerxes is doing. And as terrible as it is to be consumed by the pressures of materialism, having the latest and greatest whatever, it's a drain on our limited resources of the earth, like water and fossil fuel, just at the starter level. But most of all, it's a waste of ruining our testimony, not being wise with the resources that God has given us. The testimony that we have is everything. The story of how and why we accepted the Lord as Jesus as our Savior, and how we have been eternally forgiven, is the most important thing in our life. It is what we say, and most importantly, what we do to show others about our belief in God and how much the love that He has for us and the love that we share to them, our faith in God. And if we're to live a lifestyle that's similar to old King Xerxes, where we spend 6 months in a smashed, inebriated state, what does it say about us? To me, the obvious is that it says that we are not that different from them. We're not that different from the world. Our priorities are ourself, gluttony, drunkenness, and being a Christian is a lot lower on that list. How we live our lives should be in examples of God, showing kindness, showing love, forgiveness, grace. Not be stuck in the trap of a Christian trying to be forgiven but trying to live like the world still. That's not wise. That's not a wise use of the most important resource we have, our testimony. The lifestyle of Ahasuerus is far from being wise, though, in the state of his life. Like we mentioned, the 6-month kegger that they had, and then a second party to show how well off the king is. And I know there are some of you who are just trying to justify this by saying, if he had the resources to have his friends over, who cares? He was working. He was preparing for this upcoming war. It was needed. Let's read verse 7 and 8 again. because I need to point out one important part about this second party. Verse 7. Drinks were served in golden vessels, vessels of a different kind, and the royal wine was lavished according to the bounty of the king, and drinking was according to this edict. There is no compulsion, for the king had given orders to all staff of this palace to do as each man desired. So, this second feast had a simple rule. Guests could drink in any way they want. They can drink as much or as little as they desired, because the normal protocols for parties like this, where if the king drank, you drink. If the king's not drinking, you're not drinking. Here, in contrast, there is no rules. You can drink as much or as little as you want. You're not led by the king. It was what we would call an open bar policy. The king is liberal with his wine. This was not an ordinary party. This is not an ordinary game night with friends. This was an all-you-can-drink affair to show off the importance and wealth of the king. There is no order. There is no rules. Just drink, drink, drink. But in this second week-long party, Xerxes isn't the only one throwing it, because I saved one. There's one other jamboree happening in the town of Susa. Look at verse 9. Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the women in the palace that belonged to King Ahasuerus. Meanwhile, Queen Vashti was giving a separate banquet for the women. Separate banquets are not unusual, but I would ask, why? Did she just want a party because he was having a party? The queen's party is probably never going to go down in history books as important, or maybe not even make the entertainment section of TMZ Persia. But what's important to know, that while this is an unwise use of resources, as I have said one or two times already, both parties, for the queen and the king, are used by God to prepare a way for Esther to come onto the scene, to save Israel from certain death. The section of the story of Esther is one where he's laying the foundation for a greater story. And these three parties are important to that foundation. The three things that have stuck out to me is the intent of these parties and what they could have been used for. The first being the intent of the parties, while the king used them for battle planning. Good. But then he also used to show off his wealth and power too. God used them for something else, and more important, to get a new queen into the empire. The book of Proverbs shows an important principle when we think about this, of that while we may think we're in control of all things, God is in control of all things and showing us that he has everything under control. Because in Proverbs 21:1 it says, "A king's heart is like channeled water in the Lord's hand. He directs it where he chooses." While King Ahasuerus may have desired it for planning and prestige, God used it for something better. The second point of interest that I think I pick out of this is that there's a lack of wisdom used by both king and queen for in throwing these parties. Instead of stalling the empire of its leaders, its defense, basically everyone but the middle class, and you blowing out so many budgets over food and drink. How else could they have used that? Heck, what about us? How could we have used our resources better this past year? How could we have used them to help other people, to serve the church, to share the good news to somebody through our tithing, through supporting missions in the local church? Using our resources that God has given us wisely is something that we need to keep track of in our life, because it's easy to be wasteful. It could be as simple as turning off the faucet. One, saves water when we brush our teeth. Saving water, which is a great natural resource, but also saves us money in the process. Maybe it could be something of passing on this year's edition of the iPhone or the new Air Jordans, and then donating that money to a person or organization in need, to tithe it generally to the church. There's a lot of options. Don't be a waste. Be wise. It's not easy, but it's important.